History loves simple narratives, the oppressed and the oppressor, the conquered and the conqueror. But what happens when African royalty doesn't just survive the colonial machine, but transforms it, rules it, and shapes an entire American community for over a century? This is the story of the Bass family of South Carolina, descendants of West African nobility who didn't just endure slavery, they transcended it, building an empire that would challenge everything you think you know about power, race, and survival in colonial America. Tom Bass arrived in chains, but his bloodline would produce governors, military commanders, and political architects who controlled the fate of thousands. How does a captured African prince become the founder of a dynasty that would rule longer than most European royal houses? How do his descendants navigate a world designed to destroy them, yet emerge as the most powerful family in their region? And what price did they pay to maintain their crown in a land that refused to acknowledge their right to wear it? The year is 1670. European colonists are carving up the American Southeast like a birthday cake, each slice representing untold wealth for those bold enough to claim it. But in the marshy lowlands of South Carolina, something unprecedented is taking shape. Here among the rice fields and trading posts, an African royal lineage is about to begin a reign that will outlast the Romanovs, the Stuarts, and most of the crowned heads of Europe. The stage is set for one of history's most improbable power stories. But it begins, as so many great tales do, with catastrophe, betrayal, and a single moment that will echo through generations. Picture this. You're standing on the deck of a slave ship in 1670, but you're not looking at the human cargo below. Instead, your eyes are fixed on one man whose bearing suggests he's never bowed to anyone in his life. His name is Tom Bass, though that's not the name he was born with in the royal courts of the Senegambia region. Tom Bass was no ordinary captive. Historical records, pieced together by genealogists and confirmed through oral traditions, reveal he was likely a member of the Wolof or Mandinka nobility, kingdoms known for their sophisticated political systems and military prowess. When Portuguese slave traders captured him during a raid on his village around 1668, they had no idea they were kidnapping someone trained from birth to rule. But here's where the story takes its first shocking turn. Within 2 years of arriving in Charleston, Tom Bass wasn't picking cotton or clearing swamps like other enslaved Africans. He was negotiating, trading, building relationships with white colonists who found his intelligence and leadership abilities impossible to ignore. The South Carolina colony in 1670 was barely hanging on. Diseases decimated settlements, Native American tribes controlled vast territories, and the English colonists had no idea how to cultivate the profitable crops they desperately needed. Enter Tom Bass, who possessed something invaluable, agricultural knowledge from West Africa's advanced farming systems. Rice cultivation was the key. While European colonists struggled with the swampy lowlands, Tom Bass understood exactly how to engineer the complex irrigation systems needed to grow rice profitably. This wasn't just farming, this was hydraulic engineering that required understanding of tides, soil composition, and water management that took generations to master in West Africa. Within 5 years, Tom Bass had done the impossible. He had purchased his freedom, acquired land, and established himself as one of the most successful rice planters in the colony. But this was just the beginning of something far more audacious. By 1680, Tom Bass owned over 1,000 acres and operated with a freedom that defied every colonial law designed to keep Africans subjugated. How? He had become indispensable. His rice crops generated wealth that funded the colonial government. His knowledge of engineering and agriculture solved problems that threatened the colony's survival. But Tom Bass understood something that would define his family's strategy for the next century. True power comes not from wealth alone, but from making yourself irreplaceable to those who hold official authority. His first major political triumph came in 1682 when colonial Governor Joseph Morton appointed Tom Bass as an official intermediary between white settlers and the growing population of free Africans in the region. This wasn't just a job, it was a recognition of sovereignty. Tom Bass now held official governmental power. The appointment sent shockwaves through the colony. White settlers who had grudgingly accepted his economic success now faced something unprecedented, an African man with legal authority over their lives. Some challenged this arrangement directly, taking their complaints to the Colonial Assembly. Tom Bass's response was masterful. Rather than retreat, he doubled down. He used his position to create an elaborate network of alliances with white merchants, Native American tribes, and the growing population of mixed-race families in the region. Each alliance strengthened his political position while making potential enemies dependent on his goodwill. By 1685, Tom Bass controlled more than just rice fields. He controlled information, trade routes, and the delicate diplomatic relationships that kept South Carolina from collapsing into chaos. When pirates threatened Charleston's harbor, colonial officials turned to Tom Bass's network of informants. When Creek Indians raided outlying settlements, Tom Bass negotiated the truces. This was power, real, tangible political power that went far beyond anything wealth alone could provide. But Tom Bass was thinking bigger than his own lifetime. He was building a dynasty. Tom Bass's son, Samuel Bass, inherited more than land and money in 1698. He inherited a political machine that his father had spent 3 decades perfecting. But Samuel faced a challenge his father never had to confront: a new generation of white colonists who weren't grateful for African expertise and increasingly viewed any black success as a threat to the natural order. Samuel's response would define the Bass family strategy for the next century. If you can't rule openly, rule from the shadows. The early 1700s brought dramatic changes to South Carolina. The profitable rice industry that Tom Bass had pioneered now attracted major investment from London merchants. New plantations sprouted across the lowlands, operated by wealthy white families who had no intention of sharing power with African nobility, no matter how established. But here's where Samuel Bass demonstrated the political brilliance he inherited from his father. Rather than compete directly with these new arrivals, he became their banker. By 1705, Samuel Bass was quietly financing the expansion of white-owned plantations across the region. His lending operation was sophisticated, offering credit arrangements that made him a silent partner in dozens of major agricultural ventures. When harvest time came, Samuel Bass collected not just interest, but detailed intelligence about colonial politics, trade relationships, and future development plans. This financial network gave the Bass family something unprecedented: leverage over the white power structure without visible control that might trigger backlash. Samuel Bass knew exactly which plantations were struggling financially, which colonial officials owed money to whom, and which families were planning major business ventures before those families made their own decisions. The genius of this approach became clear during the Yamasee War of 1715 to 1717. When Native American tribes launched coordinated attacks against South Carolina settlements, colonial authorities found themselves desperately needing resources they didn't have. Food supplies, weapons, transportation, safe houses, all things that required extensive networks and immediate access to capital. Samuel Bass provided everything. His financial network allowed him to mobilize resources across the colony within days. His diplomatic connections with various African and mixed-race communities provided intelligence about Native American movements that colonial scouts couldn't gather. His rice operations fed colonial militias when government supply lines collapsed. But the masterstroke came during the war's climax. When colonial Governor Charles Craven found himself surrounded by Yamasee warriors with no way to communicate with Charleston, it was Samuel Bass's network that smuggled messages through enemy lines and coordinated the rescue operation that saved Craven's life. The grateful governor didn't just thank Samuel Bass, he made him an official colonial advisor with unprecedented authority over what were euphemistically called Negro affairs. This position gave Samuel Bass legal justification for activities that would have been impossible for any other African American: traveling freely between colonies, carrying weapons, conducting diplomatic negotiations, and exercising judicial authority over disputes involving black residents. By 1720, Samuel Bass had achieved something that seemed impossible. He held official governmental power while maintaining the financial leverage to influence major colonial decisions. When new laws needed to be passed, colonial legislators consulted Samuel Bass about their potential impact on the African American community, not out of concern for justice, but because Bass could predict and potentially organize resistance that might threaten colonial stability. Samuel's son, Thomas Bass II, pushed this influence even further. Born in 1695, Thomas grew up understanding that his family's power depended on being indispensable to white authorities while remaining invisible enough to avoid triggering organized opposition. Thomas Bass II's breakthrough came through military service. During the Anglo-Spanish conflicts of the 1730s and 1740s, colonial militias desperately needed officers who could command respect from diverse populations and navigate complex diplomatic situations. Thomas Bass II's education, military training, and extensive network of contacts made him an obvious choice. By 1742, Thomas Bass II held the rank of major in the South Carolina Colonial Militia, the highest military position ever achieved by an African American in colonial North America. But his real power came from his role as a liaison between colonial forces and the various African, Native American, and mixed-race communities whose support was essential for military success. During the Battle of Bloody Marsh in 1742, when British forces faced a Spanish invasion of Georgia, Major Thomas Bass II commanded a mixed regiment that included white colonists, free blacks, enslaved Africans fighting for their freedom, Creek Indians, and mixed-race families. This unprecedented level of integrated military command gave Bass direct influence over colonial military strategy. The victory at Bloody Marsh made Thomas Bass II a colonial hero, but it also created a political problem that would define the next phase of his family's story. An African-American military hero challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy that many white colonists weren't ready to abandon. The solution was typically ingenious. Rather than step back from public prominence, Thomas Bass II used his military reputation to transition into what we might call shadow governance. He became the unofficial coordinator of colonial intelligence networks, the mediator for disputes that official courts couldn't handle, and the negotiator for delicate diplomatic situations that required someone with credibility across racial and cultural lines. By 1750, the Bass family controlled a political network that spanned multiple colonies and included alliances with Native American tribes, connections to Caribbean trading networks, and financial relationships with merchant families from New York to Savannah. They weren't officially governors or senators, but they exercised more practical political power than most elected officials. This was the height of Bass family influence, a moment when 3 generations of strategic brilliance had created something unprecedented in American history, an African royal family that had successfully translated traditional West African political wisdom into colonial American power structures. But power this extensive, this unusual, and this successful couldn't remain hidden forever. And when the broader world finally took notice of what the Bass family had built, the consequences would test everything they had worked to achieve. Success, as Thomas Bass II learned by the 1750s, creates its own enemies. The very network of influence that had made his family indispensable also made them a target for white colonists who increasingly viewed any black autonomy as a threat to their own authority. The first serious challenge came in 1754 when a group of prominent Charleston merchants petitioned the Colonial Assembly to investigate what they called irregular commercial activities involving the Bass family. The investigation wasn't really about commerce, it was about power, and specifically about whether an African-American family should be allowed to wield the kind of influence that the Bass dynasty had accumulated. Thomas Bass II's response revealed both his political sophistication and the impossible position his success had created. He voluntarily appeared before the Colonial Assembly and provided detailed documentation of every significant transaction, contract, and governmental relationship his family had developed over 8 decades. The records were devastating for his accusers. The Bass family's financial activities were not only legal, they were essential to colonial economic stability. Their political relationships weren't corrupt favoritism, they were the informal governmental mechanisms that actually kept South Carolina functioning. Remove the Bass network, and the colony would face economic collapse within months. But Thomas Bass II understood that legal vindication wouldn't solve his real problem. White colonial society was changing, becoming less tolerant of ambiguity, and more committed to rigid racial hierarchies that had no place for African American political power, regardless of how that power had been acquired or exercised. The solution required the most difficult choice the Bass family had ever made. Thomas Bass II began systematically transferring visible aspects of his political network to white allies while maintaining actual control through financial leverage and personal relationships. This transition took nearly a decade and required sacrificing the public recognition that 3 generations of Bass family leaders had earned. By 1765, white merchants officially controlled many of the trading networks that Samuel Bass had created. White military officers held the formal positions that Thomas Bass II had pioneered. White politicians took credit for diplomatic successes that the Bass family had orchestrated. But the underlying power structure remained unchanged. The white officials who held public positions were financially dependent on Bass family networks. The merchants who operated under their own names were using capital provided through Bass family lending operations. The politicians who claimed credit for governance innovations were implementing strategies developed through Bass family political intelligence. Thomas Bass II's son, Samuel Bass II, inherited this shadow empire in 1768. Born in 1730, Samuel Bass II had grown up watching his father navigate the impossible balance between wielding power and remaining invisible. But Samuel Bass II faced a challenge that previous generations had never confronted: the American Revolution. The Revolution created an opportunity and a crisis for the Bass family. On one hand, colonial rebellion against British authority offered possibilities for reconceptualizing political power in ways that might finally allow open acknowledgement of Bass family contributions. On the other hand, revolutionary ideology's emphasis on liberty and equality highlighted the fundamental contradictions in a society that simultaneously celebrated freedom while maintaining slavery. Samuel Bass II's choice would determine not just his family's fate, but the future of African American political participation in the new nation being born. His decision was characteristically subtle and strategically brilliant. Rather than openly support either side, Samuel Bass II positioned his family's network to serve whichever faction proved victorious while maintaining relationships with both patriots and loyalists. During the British occupation of Charleston from 1780 to 1782, Bass family networks provided intelligence to both occupying forces and resistance fighters, supplied food and services to whoever could pay, and maintained the basic economic relationships that kept the region functioning despite military chaos. This careful neutrality preserved Bass family power through the Revolution's conclusion, but it also demonstrated the fundamental limitation of their position. No matter how extensive their influence, how essential their services, or how sophisticated their political strategies, the Bass family remained perpetually vulnerable to changes in white attitudes that they could influence but never fully control. The price of a century of shadow rule was becoming clear. The Bass family had achieved unprecedented political power for African Americans, but that power depended entirely on white tolerance that could be withdrawn at any moment. The American Revolution's end in 1783 marked both the culmination and the beginning of the end of Bass family political dominance. Samuel Bass II had successfully navigated the war's chaos, preserving his family's network and financial position while avoiding the persecution that destroyed many other prominent families. But the new nation that emerged from revolution had no official place for the kind of political arrangement the Bass family represented. The Constitution's emphasis on formal democratic processes and clear governmental structures left no room for the informal networks and shadow governance that had sustained Bass family power for over a century. Samuel Bass II spent his final decades, until his death in 1801, gradually transferring family assets and relationships to his children while trying to secure their future in a society that was becoming increasingly hostile to black political participation. The formal end of Bass family political influence came with the Missouri Compromise debates of 1820, when changing national attitudes towards slavery made their kind of regional power arrangement politically impossible. But here's the remarkable truth about the Bass family legacy. Their century of rule achieved something that no other African American political movement would accomplish until the Civil Rights era. They proved that African Americans could not only participate in American governance, but could excel at the sophisticated political strategies that democracy requires. The Bass family demonstrated that captured Africans weren't just laborers who could be taught simple tasks, but included trained political administrators, military strategists, and economic theorists whose knowledge was often superior to that of their supposed masters. Their success challenged fundamental assumptions about racial capacity that wouldn't be openly questioned in American society for another 2 centuries. Their network of alliances, financial relationships, and diplomatic connections created a template for African American political organizing that influenced later generations of leaders who may never have known the Bass family story. The idea that effective political power requires building coalitions across racial lines, maintaining economic independence, and making oneself indispensable to the broader community, these strategies that the Bass family pioneered became central to successful civil rights organizing. Most importantly, the Bass family proved that African Americans were never passive victims of historical forces, but active agents who shaped American development in ways that traditional histories have systematically ignored. Their century of rule raises uncomfortable questions about the stories we tell about American origins. If one African American family could accumulate this much political power in colonial and early national periods, what other contributions have been written out of our historical record? How many other examples of African American political sophistication, economic innovation, and cultural leadership disappeared from official memory because they contradicted preferred narratives about American racial history? The Bass family's story forces us to confront the possibility that African Americans weren't gradually included in American political life over centuries, but were politically active from the beginning and systematically excluded from recognition and memory by later generations who found their contributions inconvenient. What would American history look like if we acknowledged that political power, economic innovation, and cultural leadership were never white monopolies, but were always contested spaces where African Americans participated, competed, and often excelled? The Bass family ruled for over a century, not because white colonists were unusually enlightened, but because African political wisdom, economic knowledge, and diplomatic skill were essential for colonial survival and success. When those contributions were no longer needed, or when acknowledging them became politically inconvenient, the Bass family faded from official history. But their legacy remains in the questions they force us to ask: who really built America? Who really governed the colonial communities we celebrate? And what other royal dynasties are hidden in our forgotten past? What do you think? Does this story change how you understand the relationship between African Americans and political power in early America? What other hidden histories might be waiting for rediscovery? If this incredible story of royal resilience and political genius amazes you, subscribe for more forgotten chapters of American history that challenge everything you thought you knew about power, race, and survival in the New World.